Good morning. This is your national morning update from Central News. Now let's start with weather across the country. Sunny and dry for most of the West Coast, with highs in the low 80s in San Diego and Los Angeles. Cooler temperatures moving into the Midwest today with scattered storms expected across parts of Missouri and Illinois. East Coast commuters in D.C. and Baltimore should expect heavy delays following flash flooding overnight. Stay off the roads if you can. Now, over to Daniel Hart with updates on this morning's top headlines. Daniel? Thanks, Megan. We're following reports out of Minneapolis this morning where a police officer was attacked during a routine welfare check just after 4 a.m. local time. The call crackled through the precinct's dispatch with the familiar, weary static of the graveyard shift. Unit 3B, Officer Marcus Miller, grunted in acknowledgement, the sound a low rumble in his chest. He took a long, final sip of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, the bitter liquid doing little to chase away the bone-deep fatigue that settled in around the 14th hour of his double shift. The voice of the dispatcher, a young woman named Chloe, whose cheerfulness never seemed to wane, was a stark contrast to the grim quiet of the room. Calling Unit 3B, we've got a 1054, possible public intoxication, in the service alley behind O'Malley's pub on Hennepin. Caller reports a male, white, behaving erratically. No weapons seen, just strange. Miller keyed his mic. 10-4, dispatch. On my way. Strange could mean anything. It could be a drunk sleeping it off, a kid high on something new, or a homeless man lost in the throes of a mental health crisis. Miller had seen all of it 1,000 times over. It was the bread and butter of the night shift, a repetitive cycle of human misery and minor infractions. He slid into his patrol car, the worn leather of the seat groaning under his weight. The city was a ghost town at this hour, a skeleton of its daytime self, illuminated by the cold, sterile glow of streetlights and the distant, pulsing neon of a few all-night establishments. The drive to Hennepin Avenue was short, the streets empty save for a lone street sweeper making its slow, methodical pass. He eased the cruiser into the mouth of the alley, its headlights cutting a sharp, white path through the oppressive darkness. The alley smelled of stale beer, rotting garbage, and urine, the signature perfume of downtown's forgotten spaces. His headlights landed on a figure standing near a dented, overflowing dumpster. It was a man, just as the caller described. He was wearing what looked like the tattered remains of a business suit, the jacket torn at the shoulder, the white shirt beneath stained with something dark. But it wasn't his clothes that held Miller's attention. It was his posture. The man was unnervingly still, his head cocked at an unnatural angle, his arms hanging limply at his sides. There was no shivering from the pre-dawn chill, no fidgeting, no sign of the usual agitation that came with intoxication or psychosis. He was a statue carved from bad dreams. Minneapolis PD. Miller's voice boomed, amplified by the confined brick walls of the alley. Sir, I need you to show me your hands and step out into the light. The man didn't move. He didn't even seem to register the sound. A low moan, a wet, guttural noise like an animal in pain, escaped his throat. It was a sound that made the hairs on Miller's arms stand on end. He unholstered his taser, its yellow frame a small comfort in his hand. Sir, this is your final warning. Show me your hands now. He took a cautious step forward, his boots crunching on unseen debris. The man's head slowly swiveled towards him. The face was pale, almost translucent under the harsh glare of the headlights. His jaw was slack, and a thin trickle of saliva mixed with something darker snaked from the corner of his mouth. But it was the eyes that stopped Miller cold. They were wide, glassy, and completely vacant. There was no recognition, no fear, no anger. It was like looking at a doll's eyes, devoid of any light, any soul. This wasn't a drunk. This wasn't a junkie. This was something else entirely. The man took a shuffling step forward, then another. His movements were jerky, uncoordinated, like a puppet whose strings were being pulled by an unskilled master. Miller raised the taser, the red laser dot dancing on the man's chest. Stop right there. Get on the ground. The command was useless. The man's shuffling walk suddenly morphed into a lunge, a burst of speed so unexpected, so explosive that Miller barely had time to react. He squeezed the trigger of the taser. The probes shot out, latching onto the man's chest with a sharp crackle of electricity. Normally, that was the end of it. A 50,000-volt shock would drop a 300-pound linebacker like a sack of bricks, seizing their muscles into a temporary, agonizing paralysis. The man barely flinched. He stumbled for a second, a low growl ripping from his throat, and then he was on him. The impact was stunning, a raw, kinetic force that knocked the air from Miller's lungs and sent him crashing backward against the cold, grimy brick wall. The man's strength was astronomical, far beyond anything Miller had ever encountered. His hands, cold and clammy, clamped onto Miller's arms like vices. He wasn't trying to punch or grapple. He was trying to pull Miller closer. Miller struggled, planting his feet and pushing back with all his might, but it was like trying to move a concrete block. The vacant eyes were inches from his own, the foul, coppery scent of the man's breath washing over him. Then the man lowered his head and bit down on Miller's forearm. It wasn't a snap or a nip. It was a grinding, tearing pressure, a primal act of savage hunger. Pain, white-hot and blinding, exploded through Miller's arm. He screamed, a raw, ragged sound of agony and disbelief. He could feel teeth grating against bone, the tearing of muscle and sinew. He drove his knee into the man's groin, a move that would incapacitate any normal human. The man didn't react. He just kept grinding, his jaw working relentlessly. Desperate, Miller reached for his service weapon, his fingers fumbling with the holster's snap. The man was impossibly strong, his grip like iron. The moaning continued, a constant, horrifying soundtrack to the attack. Just as Miller's fingers closed around the grip of his pistol, the wail of sirens sliced through the night. 2 more patrol cars screeched to a halt at the entrance to the alley, their flashing red and blue lights painting the horrific scene in frantic, strobing colors. 2 officers, young, fresh-faced kids named Henderson and Riley, burst from their cars, their faces masks of shock. "Drop it! Get off him now!" Henderson screamed, but the attacker was oblivious. He was still latched onto Miller's arm, shaking his head back and forth like a dog with a chew toy. Riley fired his taser, the probes hitting the man in the back. Again, nothing. The man barely shuddered. It took both officers, 2 strong, fit young men, to finally pry the attacker off Miller. And even then, he fought with a terrifying, mindless fury, thrashing and biting at the air, his body contorting in a frenzied rage. They finally wrestled him to the ground, 1 officer on each limb, while a third who had just arrived managed to slap a pair of cuffs on his wrists. Miller slid down the wall, leaving a smear of blood on the bricks. He clutched his mangled forearm, the world spinning in a dizzying haze of pain and adrenaline. He looked at the wound. It was a ruin of shredded flesh and exposed muscle, blood pumping out in a sickening rhythm. Then he looked at his attacker, pinned to the filthy asphalt. The man was still fighting the restraints, his head banging rhythmically against the ground, that same low, guttural moan pouring from his lips. His vacant eyes stared up at the dawning sky, seeing nothing. The ambulance ride was a blur. Paramedics worked frantically, applying a tourniquet, pumping him full of morphine that did little to dull the searing agony. At Hennepin County Medical Center, the emergency room was a cacophony of controlled chaos. A young doctor, Dr. Eris Thorne, met them at the door. His face, usually a picture of calm confidence, tightened at the sight of Miller's injury. "What in God's name happened?" he asked, his voice sharp as he began to cut away the blood-soaked sleeve. "Human bite," the paramedic said, his own voice strained. "But it's not right. The guy who did it, he was like an animal." In an adjacent trauma bay, separated by a thin curtain, that same animal was creating havoc. It had taken 4 orderlies and 2 security guards to strap him to a gurney, and he was still thrashing with enough force to make the metal frame shudder. His moans echoed through the ER, a chilling, monotonous sound that cut through the usual symphony of beeps and voices. Dr. Thorne worked quickly, cleaning Miller's wound as best he could, his brow furrowed in concentration and disbelief. The sheer tissue damage was unlike any bite he'd ever seen. It was savage, extensive, more akin to a mauling by a large predator than an attack by another person. "We need to run a full panel," Thorne ordered a nurse. "Toxicology, blood cultures, everything. And get him started on a heavy course of broad-spectrum antibiotics. I want to know what we're dealing with." He glanced over at the curtain separating them from the attacker. A nurse with over 20 years of experience was trying to get a blood sample, her hands shaking. The attacker was completely unresponsive to verbal commands, his eyes rolling back in his head, showing only the whites. He bucked against the leather restraints, a line of bloody foam frothing at his lips. He exhibited all the signs of extreme delirium, but there was a frightening purpose to his violence, a single-minded aggression that was deeply unsettling. Back in the newsroom at Central News, the first alerts were just coming in. Megan, the morning reporter, was scanning the wires when the Minneapolis PD bulletin popped up. "Officer attacked, routine welfare check." It was a standard headline, the kind that usually warranted a 30-second mention. But as she read the brief, sanitized statement from the department spokesperson, certain phrases snagged her attention. Suspect described as unusually strong, unresponsive to commands, bitten multiple times. It was just vague enough to be professional, but just specific enough to be bizarre. Biting wasn't unheard of, especially with suspects high on PCP or bath salts, but the emphasis on unusual strength and the multiplicity of the bites felt off. She picked up her phone and dialed a source she had inside the police union. The phone rang 3 times before a gravelly voice answered. "Yeah, Mark, it's Megan Lee. I just saw the report about the officer attacked on Hennepin. What are you hearing?" There was a pause. "You don't want to know, Megan. It's a mess. Miller's in bad shape, arms torn to shreds." "What about the suspect?" she pressed. "They got him in custody. But listen, the guys who were on scene, they're spooked. Said the guy took 2 taser hits and didn't even slow down. Said it took 4 cops to hold him down, and even then, he was like a machine, just raging." Megan felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Drugs? That's what everyone's assuming. Has to be, right? Some new designer crap from a basement lab. But I've never heard of anything making someone like that. They said his eyes were just gone. Nothing there. The story was growing stranger by the minute. It was more than just a headline. It was a puzzle. She thanked her source and hung up, her mind racing. This wasn't just a 30-second filler piece anymore. In the ER at Hennepin, Dr. Thorne was reviewing Officer Miller's initial x-rays. There were hairline fractures in the ulna where the attacker's teeth had ground against the bone. He'd never documented that in a medical chart before. A nurse rushed up to him, her face pale. "Doctor, you need to see this." She handed him a tablet displaying the first results from the attacker's toxicology screen. Thorne scanned the report, his eyes widening slightly. He scrolled down, then up again, rereading the data. "Run it again," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "There has to be a mistake." "We did, sir, twice. That's the 3rd confirmation." Thorne stared at the screen, a cold dread seeping into his chest. According to the report, the man who had fought off 4 police officers, the man who had shrugged off 100,000 volts of electricity and bitten through flesh and muscle down to the bone, was completely clean. No alcohol, no cocaine, no methamphetamines, no opiates, no PCP, no bath salts, no synthetic cannabinoids. Negative for every known narcotic on the comprehensive panel. Whatever was coursing through the attacker's veins, it wasn't something they could test for. It was something new. And as Thorne looked back towards the curtain, listening to the relentless, inhuman moaning that refused to stop, he felt a profound and terrifying certainty that this was only the beginning of a very long night. Dr. Eris Thorne stared at the tablet in his hand, the screen's cold light illuminating a face etched with disbelief. The toxicology report was an impossibility, a clinical ghost. He had run it 3 times, and each result was a stark digital refutation of everything he was seeing and hearing. The man in the next bay, the one whose inhuman moans were a constant, chilling undercurrent to the ER's controlled chaos, was, by all accounts, completely sober. It made no sense. A human being could not simply will themselves to possess that kind of strength, to ignore that level of trauma. The body had limits, biochemical rules that could only be broken with powerful chemical assistance. Yet, here was the proof. No assistance detected. Doctor, the nurse who had delivered the report, was looking at him, her expression a mixture of concern and fear. What do we do? Thorne's mind, usually a rapid-fire processor of symptoms and solutions, was struggling to find purchase. Check his vitals again. Monitor his core temperature. I want to know if he's running a fever. There could be an infectious agent at play, something neurological. Meningitis, encephalitis, some kind of aggressive prion disease? The suggestion sounded weak even to his own ears. None of those conditions typically presented with this level of focused, violent aggression. As the nurse hurried away, a sudden, violent shriek erupted from the adjacent bay, followed by the terrifying sound of snapping leather. Thorne rushed over, pulling back the curtain. The scene was pure pandemonium. The attacker had broken one of the thick leather restraints on the gurney and was thrashing wildly, his one free arm swinging at the terrified orderlies. His eyes, which had been glassy and vacant, were now shot with blood, and his skin had taken on a mottled, purplish hue. A high-pitched, continuous wail escaped his lips, a sound of pure system overload agony. "He's seizing," a nurse yelled. "Get me 10 milligrams of diazepam now." It was the most violent seizure Thorne had ever witnessed. The man's body arched backward with impossible force, his spine bowing at an angle that should have snapped it. His teeth, already stained with Officer Miller's blood, were clamped so tightly together that Thorne could hear them grinding, the enamel cracking under the pressure. They managed to inject the sedative, a dose that would normally calm a raging psychotic in seconds. It had no effect. The seizure continued, a relentless electrical storm consuming the man's body. His core temperature, which had been strangely low upon admission, was now skyrocketing, 104, 106, 108 degrees. His skin was hot to the touch, and a strange coppery odor, like hot blood and burnt wires, filled the air. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The thrashing ceased. The high-pitched wail died in his throat. The body went limp against the gurney, a final, shuddering breath escaping his lungs. Dr. Thorne pressed his stethoscope to the man's chest. Silence. He checked for a pulse. Nothing. "He's in full cardiac arrest," Thorne announced, his voice tight. "Starting compressions." For the next 20 minutes they worked on him, a desperate, sweat-soaked ballet of CPR, defibrillator shocks, and injections of epinephrine. But it was useless. The man was gone. He had, in essence, burned himself out from the inside. Thorne called the time of death, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled the sheet over the man's face. He felt a profound sense of failure, not just as a doctor, but as a scientist. An unknown variable had entered his controlled world, and it had left nothing but chaos and a dead body in its wake. He had to know why. In the downtown newsroom of Central News, Megan Lee was hitting a wall. The official police statement hadn't changed, and her union source had clammed up, saying an internal gag order had come down from the chief's office. Frustrated, she turned her attention to the national feeds, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she scoured police scanner archives, local news forums, and the dark, unfiltered corners of social media. It was a long shot, a search for a needle in a continent-sized haystack. For hours, she found nothing but the usual overnight noise of a nation. Then, a keyword alert she'd set for unusual assault pinged. It was a small story out of Henderson, Nevada. The details were sparse. A man wandering into traffic near South Valley Parkway, refusing commands from officers and then charging at them, biting a deputy on the forearm before being subdued. Megan sat up straighter, a jolt of journalistic instinct cutting through her fatigue. The similarities were uncanny. She dug deeper, finding an eyewitness account on a local blog. The witness claimed the man didn't speak or scream, but only moaned. They described his face as mangled and his eyes as glassy, like he wasn't even there. A cold chill traced its way down her spine. This was it. It was the same behavior, the same vacant look, the same primal act of biting. A coincidence? Possible, but highly improbable. She broadened her search parameters. Another hit, this one even more fragmented, from a police blotter in Ashburn, Georgia. A violent disturbance at a gas station. The suspect had to be restrained by 3 people after biting another customer. Again, the report mentioned extreme, inexplicable aggression. 3 incidents, 3 different states, all within the last 24 hours. This was no longer a local story about a cop getting hurt. This was a pattern. A strange, terrifying pattern was emerging from the static of the American night, and nobody else seemed to be connecting the dots yet. The hospital morgue was a place of sterile, cold efficiency, a world away from the chaotic heat of the ER. The air was heavy with the scent of disinfectant and something older, more elemental. Dr. Thorne stood beside the medical examiner, a stoic, gray-haired man named Dr. Albright, as they looked down at the body of the attacker. Thorne had pushed for the autopsy, overriding protocol with a plea based on an unknown public health threat. I've never seen a tox screen come back so clean on a subject who presented with this level of violent delirium, Thorne explained, his voice echoing slightly off the tiled walls. And the seizure, his core temperature exceeded 108 degrees. The human body isn't built for that. Something had to be driving it. Albright nodded, making his first incision. Let's see what he has to say for himself then. For the first hour, everything appeared distressingly normal. The internal organs were healthy, showing no signs of disease or chronic drug abuse. But when Albright examined the adrenal glands, he paused. Well, that's not right. He pointed with his scalpel. The glands, which should have been small, yellowish organs perched atop the kidneys, were grotesquely swollen and had turned a deep, bruised purple, almost black. They were covered in microhemorrhages. It looks like they've been subjected to extreme prolonged stress, Albright murmured, like he was in a state of pure fight or flight for days, not hours. They've completely burned out. The discovery was unsettling, but it was nothing compared to what they found when they opened the skull. The moment Albright removed the bone flap, a faint, foul odor, like rotting meat, filled the air. He carefully lifted the brain from the cranial cavity. Large sections of the frontal lobe, the seat of reason, empathy, and decision-making, were soft and discolored, showing signs of severe necrosis. The tissue was mushy, almost liquefied in places. The limbic system, which governs primal emotions like fear and aggression, was inflamed and riddled with lesions. My God, Thorne whispered, leaning closer. This looks like advanced Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, but the progression, this would take years, not hours. The rate of decay is impossible. Albright scraped a small tissue sample onto a slide. It's not just decay, Eris. It's like something aggressively rewrote the neurology. It targeted and destroyed the parts of the brain that make us human and supercharged the parts that make us animals. Dr. Thorne stared at the ruined brain, a piece of biological hardware that had been violently and efficiently corrupted. This wasn't a drug. It wasn't a known disease. It was a weapon, a pathogen that hijacked the body and systematically erased the person inside. That evening, the soft, authoritative voice of Daniel Hart filled living rooms across the nation. Good evening, I'm Daniel Hart, and this is the Central News Now broadcast for Tuesday, July 9th. We begin tonight with a developing story that is raising questions across several U.S. cities. He spoke of the isolated disturbances that might be part of a broader pattern, detailing the attack inside a Cleveland convenience store where a man lunged at and bit another customer. He mentioned the suspect's delirium, his unresponsiveness. For Dr. Thorne, watching on a small television in his office, each word was a chilling confirmation of his own findings. Similar incidents were reported earlier today in Henderson, Nevada, and Ashburn, Georgia, Hart continued. each involving violent outbursts, physical attacks, and disturbingly, biting. We now go live to Central News correspondent Megan Lee, who's outside a police precinct in Henderson. Megan? The screen cut to Megan, looking tired but resolute, a microphone in her hand. "Thanks, Daniel," she began, her voice crisp despite the chaos she was witnessing. "I'm standing outside the 6th District Precinct in Henderson, where investigators are trying to make sense of an incident that left 2 civilians and 1 officer injured." She recounted the events, her reporting sharp and factual, but her eyes held a deeper knowledge. She knew this wasn't just a local disturbance. She described how the man had bitten the deputy on the forearm, just like the attacker in Minneapolis. She then quoted the witness who had seen it all. One witness, who asked not to be identified, said the man's face was, quote, mangled, and his eyes were glassy like he wasn't even there. Dr. Thorne felt a jolt. Glassy eyes. It was the exact phrase Officer Miller had used to describe his attacker. It was all connected. Everything he had seen, the clean toxicology, the burned-out adrenal glands, the decayed brain tissue, was not an isolated anomaly. It was a symptom of a sickness that was now popping up in cities hundreds of miles apart. He felt a desperate urge to act, to share what he knew. He picked up his office phone and dialed the public hotline for the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. After navigating an automated menu, he was placed on hold, the bland, repetitive hold music, a maddening counterpoint to the storm of urgency in his mind. Back on the television, Daniel Hart's face was grim. "Thank you, Megan. These incidents, while rare, appear to be escalating." He spoke of social media, how users were now sharing unverified clips of similar confrontations in cities like Fargo, Jacksonville, and Trenton. The screen showed a montage of grainy, terrifying footage. A shaky video from a parking garage in Trenton showed a woman in hospital scrubs tackling an EMT and trying to bite his neck. A security camera in Jacksonville captured a man in a suit repeatedly throwing himself against the glass doors of an office building, his face a bloody smear. A live stream from a bus in Fargo showed passengers screaming and scrambling away from a man at the back who was clawing at the windows, his movements jerky and inhuman. The official narrative was already crumbling, unable to keep pace with the terrifying reality spreading through the digital bloodstream of the country. Hart then turned to the network's health correspondent. We now turn to health correspondent Dr. Ela Monroe with insight on what could be causing these strange behaviors. Dr. Monroe appeared on screen, a picture of medical authority. She spoke of synthetic drugs, of flakka or bath salts, which were known to cause episodes of psychosis. Thorne shook his head at the screen, a frustrated sound escaping his lips. "It's not drugs," he said to the empty office. He knew what she didn't. He had the proof sitting on a slide in the hospital morgue. But before he could try calling the CDC again, the broadcast was interrupted by a breaking news banner. "We're getting some breaking information now," Hart's voice announced, laced with a new level of alarm. A statement just released by the National Guard confirms that a small tactical team has been deployed to assist with containment efforts in Reading, Pennsylvania. That follows reports of a disturbance in a long-term care facility there earlier this evening. The broadcast ended with a haunting final image, a live helicopter shot of the Sunrise Care Center in Reading. Emergency workers in full, bright yellow hazmat suits were escorting elderly, terrified residents from the building. Some were crying, others had their arms bandaged. Dr. Thorne stared at the screen, the bureaucratic hold music still droning in his ear. Hazmat suits, the National Guard, a long-term care facility. It was a pathogen, and it was spreading faster than anyone in charge was willing to admit. The bland hold music droned on, an infuriatingly cheerful loop of synthesized strings that felt like a mockery of the unfolding disaster Dr. Eris Thorne was witnessing on his television. He was watching the nation's immune system begin to react, National Guard troops, hazmat suits, but they were treating a symptom, not the disease. They were responding to a disturbance at a nursing home, but Thorne was holding the key to the plague itself, locked away in autopsy photos and lab reports on his computer. And the only response he could get from the nation's top public health agency was a pre-recorded message telling him his call was important. He slammed the phone down, the plastic clattering in the cradle. Frustration and a terrifying sense of isolation washed over him. He was a single doctor in a regional hospital who had stumbled upon the precipice of a species-level event. Shouting into the bureaucratic void was useless. He needed a different path, a back door. His mind raced through old contacts, mentors, and colleagues from medical school and his residency. Most were specialists, administrators, people who would be just as tangled in the red tape as the CDC. But then a name surfaced from deep in his memory, Dr. Lena Petrova. She had been his virology professor at Johns Hopkins, a brilliant, abrasive, Russian-born scientist who suffered no fools and viewed bureaucracy as a congenital defect of the intellectually mediocre. She had left academia years ago under a cloud of controversy over her aggressive pursuit of dual-use research funding and was rumored to now be a high-level consultant for USAMRID and other shadowy acronyms within the Department of Defense. She was exactly the kind of person who would either hang up on him or listen. It was a gamble. He found her details in an old alumni database, a private number for her laboratory in Maryland. He hesitated for only a moment before dialing, his heart pounding against his ribs. The phone rang once, twice, a third time. He was about to hang up when a sharp, heavily accented voice answered. "Who is this, and why are you using this number?" "Dr. Petrova, my name is Dr. Eris Thorne. I was a student of yours in 2018. I'm an ER physician at Hennepin County Medical Center in Minneapolis, and I believe I have identified a novel pathogenic agent with an unprecedented rate of neurodegeneration." There was a dead silence on the other end of the line. Thorne could picture her perfectly, stern, with piercing gray eyes, weighing his words, deciding if he was a crank or a prophet. "You have 60 seconds to convince me you are not wasting my time, Dr. Thorne." Thorne took a deep breath and laid it out, his words clipped and precise, a clinical summary of the horror. At 4:11 hours this morning, a patient was brought in after a violent assault on a police officer. Patient presented with extreme aggression, unusual strength, and was unresponsive to sedatives or electroshock. At 5:47 hours, he suffered a catastrophic seizure, core temperature reaching 108.4 degrees before cardiac arrest. The critical data point, doctor, is this. His comprehensive toxicology panel was completely clean. Post-mortem examination revealed severe necrosis of the frontal lobe and limbic system, a rate of tissue decay that is biologically impossible under any known disease progression. The adrenal glands were ablated from stress. This is not a drug. It is a pathogen, and I believe it is communicable. He finished, his breath held. The silence stretched. Then Petrova spoke, her voice devoid of any skepticism, replaced now by a chilling seriousness. "Did the patient bite the officer?" "Yes," Thorne said, "multiple times. The officer is in stable condition under quarantine." "You've isolated the agent?" "We have tissue samples from the deceased's brain, preserved and on ice." "Good," Petrova said. "You did well, doctor. Now listen to me very carefully. You will not speak of this to anyone else at your hospital. You will not contact the CDC again. You will go to your computer and you will encrypt every file you have, your autopsy notes, high-resolution photos, the lab results, everything. I am sending you a link to a secure server. You have 1 hour to upload it all. Then you will destroy the original files on your local machine. Do you understand?" "Yes, but who?" "Who I am is not important." She cut him off. "What is important is that you may be the first physician to have correctly documented the primary pathology of this event. Now go. The clock is ticking." The line went dead. Thorne stared at the phone for a second before a text message buzzed through with a complex alphanumeric web address. The fear he felt was now mixed with a spark of validation. Someone was listening. Someone knew. The emergency room at St. Luke's General Hospital in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, had become a scene from a medieval plague pit. Sarah, a nurse only 6 months out of school, felt like she was drowning. Every bed was full. Patients were lined up in the hallways on gurneys, in wheelchairs, or simply lying on the floor. And more were coming. The ambulances arrived in a constant screaming stream, their doors opening to reveal more victims of what the police were calling a series of coordinated assaults. But these weren't stab wounds or gunshot wounds. They were bites, deep, ragged, tearing bites on their faces, necks, and arms. The sheer volume of them was overwhelming. At first, they treated the wounded as they came, trying to stitch up the mangled flesh and manage the pain. But a disturbing pattern quickly emerged. Many of the bite victims, even those with relatively minor injuries, were becoming delirious. They would start sweating profusely, their eyes becoming unfocused and glassy. Then came the aggression. A middle-aged man, who'd been calmly explaining how he was bitten by a stranger at the mall, suddenly tried to bite the doctor examining him. A teenage girl had to be physically restrained after lashing out and scratching at her own mother. The hospital's supply of sedatives was dwindling at an alarming rate, and even heavy doses were proving less and less effective. Panic was beginning to fray the edges of professional calm. The senior trauma surgeon, a man Sarah had always seen as unshakable, was shouting orders with a strained, cracking voice. The air was thick with the smell of blood and antiseptic, and the sound was a horrifying symphony of pain, fear, and a new, more terrifying noise, the low, guttural moans of the ones who were starting to turn. Sarah was trying to apply a dressing to an older woman's arm when the breach happened. It started at the far end of the ER. A patient, a large construction worker who had been brought in an hour earlier with a bite on his shoulder, suddenly arched up on his gurney, snapping the restraints as if they were made of thread. He let out a horrifying roar and lunged at the nearest orderly, sinking his teeth into the man's neck. The orderly's scream was cut short with a wet gurgle. The sight of blood, fresh and arterial, seemed to act as a trigger. Like a switch being flipped, 5 other patients in the vicinity, all bite victims, began to convulse. They rose from their beds and wheelchairs, their movements jerky and unnatural, their eyes devoid of all reason. They were no longer patients. They were predators. Chaos erupted. Doctors and nurses screamed and scattered, trying to put distance between themselves and the things that had, moments before, been under their care. Security guards drew their weapons, but they hesitated, their faces pale with shock and indecision. How do you shoot a patient? The infected, blank-eyed and bloodied, moved with a singular terrifying purpose, lunging at the closest living thing. Sarah watched in horror as Dr. Evans, a kind resident who had helped her with her first IV line, was pulled down by 2 of them. It was like watching sharks in a feeding frenzy. She turned to run, grabbing another nurse by the arm. "This way! The supply closet!" They scrambled across the tiled floor, slipping on patches of blood, the sounds of carnage echoing behind them. Just as they reached the door, one of the infected, a woman whose jaw was hanging at a dislocated angle, grabbed the other nurse's leg. Sarah pulled, trying to drag her friend free, but the infected's grip was like steel. The nurse screamed as the woman bit into her calf. There was no time. With a sob of terror and guilt, Sarah let go, slammed the heavy metal door of the supply closet shut, and fumbled with the lock just as the first infected body slammed against it from the outside. Standing a block away behind a hastily erected police barricade, Megan Lee reported what she could see, her voice a steady, professional anchor in a sea of rising hysteria. "Daniel, the situation here is deteriorating by the minute," she said into the camera, the flashing lights of National Guard vehicles reflecting in her eyes. "Emergency rooms have reached full capacity, and as you can hear, the scene inside is becoming more and more chaotic." She could hear it all, the screams, the roars, a single sharp gunshot that had rung out moments before. She relayed what she knew, the bite wounds, the unconfirmed reports of medical staff being attacked. She described the convoy of military trucks that had just arrived, soldiers in full combat gear, dismounting and forming a perimeter around the hospital, their faces grim. Families are gathering outside, she said, her camera panning to a crowd of weeping, shouting people held back by the police line. They are begging for answers, but Daniel, there are no answers yet, only sirens and screaming. She felt a vibration in her pocket, a text from her news editor. Scanners in Northbridge and Harrow Point just went silent, signal failure or something else. She took a deep breath before her sign-off, the weight of what she was witnessing, the pattern she had been chasing all day, finally coalescing into a single, terrifying thought. This is no longer an isolated medical emergency, she said, her voice dropping slightly, imbued with a gravity that went beyond the report. Something more is happening, something we don't understand. Back to you. In her hardened, electromagnetically shielded laboratory in Fort Meade, Maryland, Dr. Lena Petrova watched the data from Minneapolis scroll across her screen. The images of the necrotic brain tissue were chilling. The speed of the cellular decay was something she would have thought impossible, something out of a biological horror novel. This was no natural mutation. The precise way it targeted the brain's higher functions while leaving the brain stem and motor controls intact was too efficient, too elegant. It was engineered. She ran the unique protein markers from Thorne's analysis against a series of classified threat databases. For a moment, nothing. Then a single result flashed on the screen, flagged with the highest possible security classification. Project Helix Fall. Status, archived contained. 2015. Her blood ran cold. She had heard rumors about Helix Fall years ago, a DARPA bioweapon project designed to create a neurological agent that could override empathy and rational thought in enemy combatants. It was officially shut down after a catastrophic failure at a research facility outside New Haven. They had claimed the pathogen was inert, that it could not survive outside the lab. They had lied. She picked up a secure satellite phone, her knuckles white as she dialed a direct line to a 4-star general at the Pentagon. "General," she said, her voice tight with fury and dread. "Petrova, we have a Black Veil event, the Minneapolis incident. The agent is a positive match for the Helix strain." There was a pause on the other end, then a string of curses. "That's not possible, Lena. The samples were destroyed." "Were they?" she shot back. "Because I am looking at evidence that says otherwise. This is not a regional crisis. This is a complete loss of containment. You need to activate Protocol Zero now, before the whole damn eastern seaboard goes dark." Inside the supply closet at St. Luke's General, Sarah huddled in the darkness, her body shaking uncontrollably. The sounds from outside the door were a hellscape of snarling, wet-chewing noises and the rhythmic, dull thud of bodies slamming against the metal. She was trying to control her breathing, trying not to sob and give away her position. In the dim light filtering under the door, she looked down at her arm. During the scramble to get inside, one of the infected had clawed at her, its fingernails digging into her skin. 4 deep, parallel scratches ran from her wrist to her elbow, beading with blood. A wave of nausea and terror unlike anything she had ever known washed over her. Was it enough? Could the pathogen be transmitted through a scratch? She didn't know. Nobody knew anything. She was trapped, alone, and possibly already infected. All she could do was wait and listen to the sounds of the world ending just outside the door. The darkness inside the supply closet was absolute, a thick, suffocating blanket that muted all senses except for hearing. And for Sarah, hearing was now a curse. The sounds seeping through the metal door were the auditory landscape of hell. The initial chaos of screams and gunshots had subsided, replaced by something far more sinister, a wet, rhythmic tearing, punctuated by low, guttural moans. It was the sound of a feast. She huddled between shelves of sterile gauze and IV bags, her hand clamped over her own mouth to stifle the sobs that threatened to rack her body. Every moan from the hallway seemed to vibrate through the concrete floor, a bass note of pure menace. Her mind was a slideshow of horrors, the blank, predatory eyes of her patients, the the surprised scream of the orderly as his throat was torn out, the desperate grip of her friend, the nurse whose leg was seized by the dislocated jaw woman. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She had let go. She had slammed the door. She had saved herself, and in doing so, she had condemned her friend to that feasting sound. She drew her knees to her chest, trying to make herself smaller, trying to disappear. Her arm throbbed. In the pitch black, she couldn't see the scratches, but she could feel them, 4 burning lines etched into her skin. Was it enough? Was the pathogen in the fingernails? In the blood she'd been spattered with? Was it already inside her, a silent, microscopic time bomb rewriting her cells, preparing to extinguish the terrified, weeping girl in this closet and replace her with one of the moaning things outside? Time lost all meaning. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The noises in the hallway began to change. The feeding sounds subsided, and the moaning grew more agitated, more mobile. She heard shuffling, the scrape of shoes on linoleum, the dull thud of a body bumping into a wall. Then, a new sound from deeper within the hospital, a loud, metallic crash, followed by a fresh wave of human screams. The sounds outside her door receded, the shuffling and moaning moving away, drawn toward the new stimulus like moths to a flame. A window. It was a chance. She knew she couldn't stay here. Eventually, one of them would wander back, would rattle the handle, would start throwing itself against the door until the lock gave way. The closet was a tomb in waiting. Her objective, born of adrenaline and a sliver of desperate hope, was the rooftop helipad. It was the ultimate last resort, a place for evacuating critical patients in the face of a natural disaster. This was a disaster. She was a critical patient. The logic was thin, but it was all she had. Taking a shuddering breath, she rose to her feet. Her hands, slick with sweat, found the doorknob. She turned the lock with an excruciatingly loud click. Peering through the tiny wire-reinforced window in the door, she saw a hallway transformed. The lights flickered erratically, illuminating a scene of abject carnage. Bodies, or pieces of bodies, lay strewn across the floor. An overturned gurney blocked the path, its wheels still spinning slowly. The walls were smeared with bloody handprints, but it was empty. The pack had moved on, now or never. She slipped out of the closet, her sneakers making no sound on the blood-slicked floor. The smell was overpowering, a coppery, visceral stench of slaughter that made her stomach heave. She navigated the gruesome obstacle course, her eyes scanning every shadow, every doorway. She had to get to the stairwell at the end of the hall. Halfway there, a low moan came from an open patient room to her left. Sarah froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Peeking around the doorframe, she saw him. It was Dr. Evans, the kind resident. He was on his knees over what was left of another doctor, his back to her, his shoulders hunched as he fed. The sight was so monstrous, so fundamentally wrong, that her mind momentarily refused to process it. Then his head snapped up, and he turned. His jaw was covered in blood, and his eyes were the same milky, vacant orbs she now saw in her nightmares. He wasn't Dr. Evans anymore. He was just a thing. The thing saw her. It let out a guttural hiss and scrambled to its feet, moving toward her with that same jerky, unnatural gait. Panic gave her speed. She ran. Her feet flew down the corridor as the thing gave chase behind her. She reached the stairwell door, her fumbling hands struggling with the heavy push bar. The thing was closing in, its ragged breathing a horrifying percussion behind her. She finally burst through the door, slamming it shut, just as the infected doctor's body crashed against it. She didn't wait to see if it would hold. She just ran, taking the concrete steps 2 at a time, her lungs burning, the sounds of her own ragged breaths echoing in the enclosed space. In the brightly lit, climate-controlled studio of Central News Now, Daniel Hart was losing his grip on the narrative. What began as a series of strange but seemingly isolated incidents had, in the space of a few hours, metastasized into a full-blown national catastrophe. The newsroom was in a state of organized panic, producers shouting, phones ringing off the hook, and every screen displaying a new facet of the nation's violent, inexplicable collapse. Reports were flooding in too fast to verify, a fire hose of chaos. A producer handed him a flash drive, unverified body cam footage from a state trooper, Interstate 41. The clip played on his monitor, a grainy, chaotic scene. A trooper approaches a man wandering in traffic, his clothes soaked in blood. The trooper is shouting commands. The man is completely unresponsive. Then he lunges, faster than a man should move, and latches onto the trooper's partner, his teeth sinking into the officer's neck. The camera spins wildly, and the feed cuts out. Another alert screamed from his earpiece. We have a confirmed lockdown at Brookville Elementary School in Illinois. Multiple casualties reported. The details were sickening. Teachers and students had suddenly become violently ill, then erupted into a state of frenzied, animalistic rage. One teacher had reportedly broken a classroom window with her bare hands to get out. Children were seen climbing on desks and biting each other. It was a horror too profound to properly articulate on a live broadcast. And it kept coming. Conflicting reports from the Oakidge subway system, passengers clawing at the train windows. All transit services in and out of the city were suspended indefinitely. The infrastructure was failing. Cell service was becoming unreliable across the entire eastern seaboard. They had lost contact with their affiliate stations in Northbridge and Harrow Point. They had simply gone dark. He was no longer reporting the news. He was narrating the first chapter of a history book about the end of the world. Wake up, people. You think this is normal? The voice on the live stream was raw, angry, and unfiltered. It belonged to a man with a wild beard and eyes that burned with a furious intensity, broadcasting from a cluttered basement filled with radio equipment and maps. You think hospitals overflowing overnight is just a bad flu season? You've got people biting each other in parking lots, nurses barricading ICU wings, and we're supposed to sit here and believe this is just a regional crisis? He scoffed, a bitter barking sound. Bull, this didn't just happen. This was allowed to happen. We've been warning you for years that something like this was coming. The government ran simulations, Dark Winter, Crimson Contagion, Atlas X, and they all ended the same way. Mass civil unrest, medical collapse, and total institutional failure. And what did they do? They buried the reports and told you to wash your hands and trust the system. He leaned into the camera, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rasp. You want to know the truth? It's not just panic. It's contagion. It's neurological. It's aggressive. And it's moving fast. I'm seeing reports of people attacking their own families in silence with blank stares. And still no word from the White House? Nothing but rumors that Air Force One has already been scrambled west? Get out of the cities. Now! Stock up on water, food, and ammo. Yes, ammo, because when this thing breaks wide, law enforcement won't be coming to your door. They'll be running from it. The collapse won't be televised, folks. 1 hour, you're watching game shows. The next, you're watching your neighbor rip someone's throat out in your driveway. You have hours, maybe days. Get ready now. Sarah burst through the door onto the roof of St. Luke's General, gasping for air, the muscles in her legs screaming. The cold night air was a shock, a welcome slap in the face after the claustrophobic terror of the stairwell. For a moment, she felt a surge of triumph. She had made it, but the feeling evaporated as she took in the scene. The helipad was empty, a silent, painted circle on a vast, dark rooftop. There was no helicopter, no sound of approaching blades, no rescue on the way. Below her, the city of Oakidge was a patchwork of light and spreading darkness. She could see the glow of multiple fires, the frantic, strobing lights of emergency vehicles congregating in pockets of chaos, and hear the distant, unending chorus of sirens and screams. She was on an island, high above a dying city. The hope that had propelled her up 12 flights of stairs curdled into despair. She was trapped. A producer's voice, tight with anxiety, crackled in Daniel Hart's earpiece. Daniel, we have a problem. The front entrance has been breached. Security is telling me they're infected. We have been instructed to begin powering down studio operations and move to the secure broadcast room. The chaos was no longer outside, it was here. Daniel's professional veneer finally cracked, a flicker of raw fear in his eyes, but he held it together, his voice strained but steady as he turned to the camera for what he knew might be the last time. "If our signal drops," he said, his words measured and heavy, "please remain calm. Monitor official emergency channels on radio and government alert systems. Our technicians are working to maintain the broadcast, but if we go dark, we'll do everything we can to return. Please, stay safe." On the rooftop, Sarah heard it, a new sound, cutting through the ambient noise of the burning city. It was coming from the stairwell door she had just come through, a scraping, metallic groan, then a heavy, rhythmic thudding. They had followed her. The thing that used to be Dr. Evans and perhaps others were on the other side of the door, throwing themselves against it. The metal buckled visibly with each impact. She scrambled backward, away from the door, her eyes wide with terror. She was trapped on a flat, empty roof, 12 stories up, with the empty night sky above her and a horde of insatiable monsters about to break through her only exit. The door buckled again, a metal hinge screaming as it began to tear free. There was nowhere left to run. The tearing screech of metal screamed in Sarah's ears as the stairwell door buckled, its lock finally surrendering to the relentless, inhuman force. She scrambled backward, her sneakers slipping on the gravel-dusted tar of the rooftop. The door burst open, and the thing that had been Dr. Evans stumbled out into the moonlight, its head swiveling, its milky eyes scanning for prey. Behind it, another figure followed, the nurse with the dislocated jaw who had attacked her friend. They were a grotesque parody of a medical team, their scrubs stained black with blood, their movements jerky and predatory. There was nowhere to run. The rooftop was a flat, open kill box, surrounded on all sides by a 12-story drop. Panic gave way to a surge of pure, primal survival instinct. Her eyes darted around, landing on the massive, humming HVAC unit bolted to the center of the roof. It was her only cover. She scrambled behind it, pressing her back against the cool, vibrating metal. She could hear them shuffling closer, their guttural moans a horrifying form of echolocation. Peeking around the edge, she saw a length of thick metal electrical conduit that had been left behind by a maintenance crew, lying near the base of the unit. A weapon. She snatched it up, its weight a small cold comfort in her trembling hands. The infected nurse was the first to round the corner of the HVAC unit. It saw her and lunged, its one good arm outstretched, its broken jaw snapping silently. Sarah didn't think. She just reacted, swinging the heavy conduit pipe with all her might. The pipe connected with the infected's knee with a sickening wet crunch. The leg buckled, sending the creature stumbling forward, its momentum carrying it in an uncontrolled stagger. It didn't scream. It just pitched forward, its arms flailing, and tumbled silently over the low parapet at the edge of the roof. One down. But the victory was short-lived. Dr. Evans was on her now, lunging over the spot where the other had been. He was faster, stronger. Sarah swung the pipe again, but he batted it aside with a sweep of his arm, the force of the blow nearly tearing the pipe from her grasp. He backed her against the humming machinery, cornering her, his blood-stained hands reaching for her. In a fortified bunker, deep beneath the Central News Now broadcast center, Daniel Hart and the skeletal remains of his news crew had managed to achieve a miracle. By piggybacking on the network's connection to the National Emergency Broadcast System, they were on the air again, a lone voice of reason in a hurricane of static. Their television signal was gone, but their audio was being carried on every available AM and FM frequency. They were a radio station at the end of the world. A frantic message came through from their producer in the control booth. "Daniel, we're getting a priority feed from the White House comms agency. It's the president. He's about to address the nation. We're patching it through now." Daniel leaned into his microphone, his voice grave. "We are interrupting our coverage with a live address from the President of the United States. The feed crackled, and then the voice of President Rusk filled the airwaves, not from a podium in the White House, but from a place that sounded small, sterile, and metallic. "My fellow Americans," the president began, his tone a bizarre mix of feigned confidence and barely concealed panic. "What we are witnessing is unlike anything we've ever seen before. And I've seen a lot. Okay, a lot of things, tremendous things." Daniel listened, his expression hardening. The president confirmed what many had feared. The incidents were being caused by a new kind of pathogen, one that was viral and spread real fast. He gave the horror a name. "We're calling it viral aggression syndrome. That's what the CDC is going with. I came up with it. Sounds strong." Strong, Daniel thought, but meaningless. A label to put on the apocalypse. The president then laid out the government's response, and each measure was another nail in the coffin of the old world. All inbound flights suspended, travel inside major cities restricted, roadblocks were being set up. He was isolating the country from itself. Then came the most chilling part of the address, a piece of advice that shattered the very foundation of society. "If someone you know, even someone you love, starts acting strangely," the president urged, his voice heavy, "you isolate them. You call the hotline. You don't wait." The implication was monstrous. Your family, your friends, your neighbors, they were all potential enemies. The social contract was officially null and void. "We are Americans, and we don't panic. We win," Rusk concluded, his voice a hollow echo of patriotic fervor. "God bless the United States of America." The feed cut out, leaving only the hum of the broadcast equipment in the bunker. It was official. The chaos had a name, and the government's response was to wall off the sick and tell everyone else to fend for themselves. The reanimated Dr. Evans lunged, his fingers brushing against the collar of Sarah's scrubs. She screamed and scrambled backward, climbing onto the top of the humming HVAC unit to get away from him. He clawed at the metal casing, trying to get a handhold to pull himself up. Just as his fingers hooked over the edge, a new sound ripped through the night, deafening and immediate. A thunderous thump, thump, thump washed over the rooftop, accompanied by a blinding white light. A military helicopter, a Black Hawk, materialized out of the darkness, hovering low over the hospital. It wasn't a rescue. It was a Civil Air Patrol flight, its side door open, a soldier manning a heavy machine gun. The helicopter's searchlight swept across the roof, pinning the infected Dr. Evans in its beam. The creature froze, momentarily bewildered by the intense light and noise, shielding its vacant eyes. The distraction was all Sarah needed. She saw her chance. About 10 feet away was the concrete housing for the hospital's elevator machinery, slightly taller than the HVAC unit. In a single, desperate, adrenaline-fueled act, she took a running start and leaped across the gap. Her feet hit the edge of the concrete housing, her sneakers scraping for purchase. She windmilled her arms, teetering on the edge for a heart-stopping second before finding her balance. Below her, the helicopter, having seen only chaotic movement and unable to identify a clear target or a survivor in need of rescue, banked sharply and roared off into the night, its searchlight cutting a path over the burning city. The hope of rescue vanished as quickly as it had appeared. But it had saved her. From her new vantage point, she saw it. An old, rust-colored fire escape ladder bolted to the far side of the building. It was a way down, a way out. Daniel Hart's voice was somber as he summarized the president's address for the listeners who were just tuning in. If you're just joining us, the president has confirmed a fast-spreading, highly aggressive infection, now formally designated as viral aggression syndrome. Travel is being restricted, and Americans have been urged to isolate anyone showing signs of aggression, even family. As he spoke, a red light flashed on his console. An urgent, unverified report was coming in from an affiliate in Kentucky. He read the text on his screen, his blood running cold. A firehouse in a rural county had been found completely abandoned. All vehicles were in the bay, gear was still on the racks, and the radios were still transmitting, but the first responders themselves were gone. It was a ghost station. The thin line of defense that held society together wasn't just breaking, it was vanishing. He had to make a choice. Reporting this could incite even more panic, but not reporting it felt like a lie. For now, he stuck to the facts he could confirm, but the knowledge sat like a stone in his gut. The system was in a state of cascading failure. Sarah's descent was a nightmare. The metal of the fire escape was cold and slick with dew, the rungs groaning under her weight. Every floor she passed was a window into a fresh horror. On the 11th floor, she saw an infected nurse in the hallway, methodically slamming her own head against the reinforced window, the glass cracking in a spiderweb pattern. On the 9th, a small group of them were hunched over a body in a patient room, their movements frantic and gluttonous. The city's ambient chaos seemed to fade, replaced by the immediate, claustrophobic terror of the things just a few inches of glass away from her. As she climbed past the 7th floor, a hand, bloody and pale, suddenly punched through a window just below her feet, grasping blindly for her ankle. She yelped and scrambled down faster, the sound of shattering glass echoing behind her. She didn't stop until her feet hit the final platform, the ladder ending a full story above a dark, trash-filled alley. There was no other way down. She took a deep breath, gauged the distance, and jumped. She landed hard in a pile of overflowing trash bags next to a large metal dumpster, the impact jarring her bones but breaking her fall. She was alive. She was out. She scrambled behind the dumpster, her body screaming with pain and exhaustion, and peered around its edge. The alley opened onto a street illuminated by a single, flickering streetlight. In the stuttering orange glow, she saw them. Silhouettes, moving with that familiar, shambling gait. A small horde of them was shuffling down the center of the street, their collective moans a low, constant dirge. The contained, vertical terror of the hospital was gone, replaced by the sprawling, horizontal threat of a city that had been utterly consumed. She was free, but she was also adrift in an ocean of monsters. The alley was a cage of shadows and stench. Sarah huddled behind the dumpster, making herself as small as possible, every muscle in her body screaming in protest from the 12-story descent and the final, bone-jarring leap. The horde shuffled past the mouth of the alley, a relentless, moaning river of the dead. She watched them, a collection of silhouettes against the flickering streetlights. Men, women, some still in pajamas, others in work clothes, a grotesque cross-section of a town that had died in its sleep. The scratches on her arm burned, a constant, terrifying reminder of her potential fate. Was it a countdown? Was the virus, the syndrome as the president had called it, already mapping her veins, staging a silent coup in her own cells? The fear was a cold, physical thing, a knot of ice in her gut. She was a nurse. She understood pathology, incubation periods, transmission vectors. But this was something outside of medicine. This was a monster from a dark fairy tale, and its rules were unknown. All she could do was wait for the sun, praying it would bring with it some measure of safety, some reprieve from the things that hunted in the dark. As the first, faint, bruised purple light of dawn began to stain the eastern sky, the moaning on the street began to subside. The horde thinned, the shuffling figures seeming to retreat from the light, dispersing into the shadows of buildings and down darker streets. A fragile, eerie silence descended, broken only by the distant wail of a single unanswered car alarm. She knew she couldn't stay. The alley was exposed, a temporary hiding place that would become a trap. She needed water, food, a defensible shelter, and most of all, she needed to clean her wounds properly. Survival was now a series of immediate, practical problems. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she crept out from behind the dumpster. The street was a vision of abrupt apocalypse. Cars were stopped haphazardly, some with their doors hanging open. A looted pharmacy had its windows smashed, empty pill bottles crunching underfoot. She moved quietly, her head on a swivel, every dark doorway a potential threat. 100 yards down, she saw a patrol car, its red and blue lights still flashing weakly, casting a ghostly pallor on the scene. Its doors were open, a grim opportunity. She approached with extreme caution, her makeshift weapon, the heavy electrical conduit pipe, held ready. The front seats were empty, but the tableau in the back was horrifying. A single, bloody handprint was smeared on the inside of the plexiglass divider. She forced herself to look away, focusing on the task. The trunk had been popped. Inside, alongside road flares and a riot shield, was a large black trauma kit, gold. She unzipped it, her hands shaking. It was fully stocked. Saline solution, rolls of gauze, antiseptic wipes, butterfly stitches. As she rummaged, her fingers brushed against something hard and heavy. A large, 5-cell Maglite flashlight. It was better than her pipe. She took it, along with as many medical supplies as she could stuff into her pockets. Retreating back to the relative safety of the alley, she began the painful, terrifying ritual of cleaning her arm. Tearing open an antiseptic wipe, the alcohol stung as she scrubbed at the 4 deep scratches, cleaning away the dried blood and grime. The fear was a constant whisper in her mind. Is it too late? Is it already inside you? All she could do was act as if it wasn't. She bandaged the arm tightly, the clean, white gauze a stark contrast to the filth and horror surrounding her. It was a small act of order in a world of chaos, a tiny reclamation of her old self, the healer. Glad to be here, and I'm going to say this flat out. The man on the live stream was Caleb Rook, a controversial talk radio host whose broadcasts had been deplatformed from every mainstream service, but who now commanded a massive audience from a fortified studio in the Rocky Mountains. His guest, a man with the intense, hollowed-out eyes of a true believer, nodded grimly. What we're watching unfold right now was never about a virus, Rook declared, his voice a low, gravelly snarl. This isn't new. This isn't spontaneous. This is a controlled burn of society as we know it. He leaned forward, his face filling the screen. The government, the contractors, the alphabet agencies, they've planned for it, and now they're using it to push the real agenda. Control, fear, compliance. This outbreak, it's the match. But the gas has been leaking for years. The guest chimed in. People hear that and say, come on, that's crazy. So lay it out. The biting, the violence, people getting up after being shot. You're saying that's not just a virus? I'm saying it's manufactured, Rook shot back. There was a program under DARPA in 2015 called Project Helix Fall. I've seen the redacted docs. They were designing neurological bioweapons to strong. Strong, Daniel thought, but meaningless. A label to put on the apocalypse. The president then laid out the government's response, and each measure was another nail in the coffin of the old world. All inbound flights suspended. Travel inside major cities restricted. Roadblocks were being set up. He was isolating the country from itself. Then came the most chilling part of the address, a piece of advice that shattered the very foundation of society. If someone you know, even someone you love, starts acting strangely, the president urged, his voice heavy, you isolate them. You call the hotline. You don't wait. The implication was monstrous. Your family, your friends, your neighbors, they were all potential enemies. The social contract was officially null and void. We are Americans, and we don't panic. We win, Russ concluded, his voice a hollow echo of patriotic fervor. God bless the United States of America. The feed cut out, leaving only the hum of the broadcast equipment in the bunker. It was official. The chaos had a name, and the government's response was to wall off the sick and tell everyone else to fend for themselves. The reanimated Dr. Evans lunged, his fingers brushing against the collar of Sarah's scrubs. She screamed and scrambled backward, climbing onto the top of the humming HVAC unit to get away from him. He clawed at the metal casing, trying to get a handhold to pull himself up. Just as his fingers hooked over the edge, a new sound ripped through the night, deafening and immediate. A thunderous thump, thump, thump washed over the rooftop, accompanied by a blinding white light. A military helicopter, a Black Hawk, materialized out of the darkness, hovering low over the hospital. It wasn't a rescue. It was a civil air patrol flight, its side door open, a soldier manning a heavy machine gun. The helicopter's searchlight swept across the roof. pinning the infected Dr. Evans in its beam. The creature froze, momentarily bewildered by the intense light and noise, shielding its vacant eyes. The distraction was all Sarah needed. She saw her chance. About 10 feet away was the concrete housing for the hospital's elevator machinery, slightly taller than the HVAC unit. In a single, desperate, adrenaline-fueled act, she took a running start and leaped across the gap. Her feet hit the edge of the concrete housing, her sneakers scraping for purchase. She windmilled her arms, teetering on the edge for a heart-stopping second before finding her balance. Below her, the helicopter, having seen only chaotic movement and unable to identify a clear target or a survivor in need of rescue, banked sharply and roared off into the night, its searchlight cutting a path over the burning city. The hope of rescue vanished as quickly as it had appeared. But it had saved her. From her new vantage point, she saw it, an old, rust-colored fire escape ladder bolted to the far side of the building. It was a way down, a way out. Daniel Hart's voice was somber as he summarized the president's address for the listeners who were just tuning in. If you're just joining us, the president has confirmed a fast-spreading, highly aggressive infection, now formally designated as viral aggression syndrome. Travel is being restricted, and Americans have been urged to isolate anyone showing signs of aggression, even family. As he spoke, a red light flashed on his console. An urgent, unverified report was coming in from an affiliate in Kentucky. He read the text on his screen, his blood running cold. A firehouse in a rural county had been found completely abandoned. All vehicles were in the bay, gear was still on the racks, and the radios were still transmitting. But the first responders themselves were gone. It was a ghost station. The thin line of defense that held society together wasn't just breaking, it was vanishing. He had to make a choice. Reporting this could incite even more panic, but not reporting it felt like a lie. For now, he stuck to the facts he could confirm, but the knowledge sat like a stone in his gut. The system was in a state of cascading failure. Sarah's descent was a nightmare. The metal of the fire escape was cold and slick with dew, the rungs groaning under her weight. Every floor she passed was a window into a fresh horror. On the 11th floor, she saw an infected nurse in the hallway, methodically slamming her own head against the reinforced window, the glass cracking in a spiderweb pattern. On the 9th, a small group of them were hunched over a body in a patient room, their movements frantic and gluttonous. The city's ambient chaos seemed to fade, replaced by the immediate, claustrophobic terror of the things just a few inches of glass away from her. As she climbed past the 7th floor, a hand, bloody and pale, suddenly punched through a window just below her feet, grasping blindly for her ankle. She yelped and scrambled down faster, the sound of shattering glass echoing behind her. She didn't stop until her feet hit the final platform, the ladder ending a full story above a dark, trash-filled alley. There was no other way down. She took a deep breath, gauged the distance, and jumped. She landed hard in a pile of overflowing trash bags next to a large metal dumpster, the impact jarring her bones but breaking her fall. She was alive. She was out. She scrambled behind the dumpster, her body screaming with pain and exhaustion, and peered around its edge. The alley opened onto a street illuminated by a single, flickering streetlight. In the stuttering orange glow, she saw them, silhouettes, moving with that familiar, shambling gait. A small horde of them was shuffling down the center of the street, their collective moans a low, constant dirge. The contained, vertical terror of the hospital was gone, replaced by the sprawling, horizontal threat of a city that had been utterly consumed. She was free, but she was also adrift in an ocean of monsters. The alley was a cage of shadows and stench. Sarah huddled behind the dumpster, making herself as small as possible, every muscle in her body screaming in protest from the 12-story descent and the final, bone-jarring leap. The horde shuffled past the mouth of the alley, a relentless, moaning river of the dead. She watched them, a collection of silhouettes against the flickering streetlights, men, women, some still in pajamas, others in work clothes, a grotesque cross-section of a town that had died in its sleep. The scratches on her arm burned, a constant, terrifying reminder of her potential fate. Was it a countdown? Was the virus, the syndrome as the president had called it, already mapping her veins, staging a silent coup in her own cells? The fear was a cold, physical thing, a knot of ice in her gut. She was a nurse. She understood pathology, incubation periods, transmission vectors, but this was something outside of medicine. This was a monster from a dark fairy tale, and its rules were unknown. All she could do was wait for the sun, praying it would bring with it some measure of safety, some reprieve from the things that hunted in the dark. As the first, faint, bruised purple light of dawn began to stain the eastern sky, the moaning on the street began to subside. The horde thinned, the shuffling figures seeming to retreat from the light, dispersing into the shadows of buildings and down darker streets. A fragile, eerie silence descended, broken only by the distant wail of a single unanswered car alarm. She knew she couldn't stay. The alley was exposed, a temporary hiding place that would become a trap. She needed water, food, a defensible shelter, and most of all, she needed to clean her wounds properly. Survival was now a series of immediate practical problems. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she crept out from behind the dumpster. The street was a vision of abrupt apocalypse. Cars were stopped haphazardly, some with their doors hanging open. A looted pharmacy had its windows smashed, empty pill bottles crunching underfoot. She moved quietly, her head on a swivel, every dark doorway a potential threat. 100 yards down, she saw a patrol car, its red and blue lights still flashing weakly, casting a ghostly pallor on the scene. Its doors were open, a grim opportunity. She approached with extreme caution, her makeshift weapon, the heavy electrical conduit pipe, held ready. The front seats were empty, but the tableau in the back was horrifying. A single bloody handprint was smeared on the inside of the plexiglass divider. She forced herself to look away, focusing on the task. The trunk had been popped. Inside, alongside road flares and a riot shield, was a large black trauma kit, gold. She unzipped it, her hands shaking. It was fully stocked. Saline solution, rolls of gauze, antiseptic wipes, butterfly stitches. As she rummaged, her fingers brushed against something hard and heavy. A large, 5-cell Maglite flashlight. It was better than her pipe. She took it, along with as many medical supplies as she could stuff into her pockets. Retreating back to the relative safety of the alley, she began the painful, terrifying ritual of cleaning her arm. Tearing open an antiseptic wipe, the alcohol stung as she scrubbed at the 4 deep scratches, cleaning away the dried blood and grime. The fear was a constant whisper in her mind. Is it too late? Is it already inside you? All she could do was act as if it wasn't. She bandaged the arm tightly, the clean, white gauze a stark contrast to the filth and horror surrounding her. It was a small act of order in a world of chaos, a tiny reclamation of her old self, the healer. Glad to be here, and I'm going to say this flat out. The man on the live stream was Caleb Rook, a controversial talk radio host whose broadcasts had been deplatformed from every mainstream service, but who now commanded a massive audience from a fortified studio in the Rocky Mountains. His guest, a man with the intense, hollowed-out eyes of a true believer, nodded grimly. What we're watching unfold right now was never about a virus, Rook declared, his voice a low, gravelly snarl. This isn't new. This isn't spontaneous. This is a controlled burn of society as we know it. He leaned forward, his face filling the screen. The government, the contractors, the alphabet agencies, they've planned for it, and now they're using it to push the real agenda. Control, fear, compliance. This outbreak, it's the match. But the gas has been leaking for years. The guest chimed in. People hear that and say, come on, that's crazy. So lay it out. The biting, the violence, people getting up after being shot. You're saying that's not just a virus? I'm saying it's manufactured, Rook shot back. There was a program under DARPA in 2015 called Project Helix Fall. I've seen the redacted docs. They were designing neurological bioweapons to override empathy, pain response, and rational thought. What does that look like in plain terms? People tearing each other apart without flinching, people who can't be stopped unless they're destroyed. This isn't natural, it's engineered. He scoffed, pointing a finger at the camera. And the president's broadcast? Don't make me laugh. That wasn't the White House. That was a hardened bunker, probably deep under Cheyenne Mountain. I've got a contact in NORAD who confirmed Air Force One diverted hours before the speech. They got him underground fast. You don't do that unless you know the country is about to go dark. He finished by giving his terrified audience their new commandments for this new world. Get out of the cities, now. I don't care how safe your neighborhood feels. It won't when the lights go out. Stock up on water, long-life food, medical kits, and weapons. Yes, weapons. You see someone foaming, twitching, blood running down their face. Don't ask questions. Don't hesitate, because what's coming through that door isn't your friend or your neighbor anymore. It's something else, and it won't stop until you do. Sarah moved through the dead streets like a ghost. The rising sun did little to burn away the oppressive atmosphere of dread. It only illuminated the horror in greater detail. She needed a place to hide, to rest, to think. Halfway down a side street, she saw it, a small two-story brick building that housed a bookstore, the Bound Folio. What made it perfect was the heavy, wrought-iron security gate that had been pulled down over the front windows and door. The glass behind the gate was smashed, but the gate itself was solid, unbreached. It was a cage, but a cage that could keep things out. She circled around to the back alley. The rear service door, a heavy steel affair, had been pried open, the lock broken. Her heart pounded. This was the risk. Someone or something could be inside. But the alley was empty, and the thought of spending another night out in the open was more terrifying than the unknown inside the store. Gripping her new maglite like a club, she slipped through the broken door into the darkness within. The air inside was cool and smelled of old paper and dust, a scent from another lifetime. The back room was a mess of overturned boxes and packing material, but it was empty of threats. The main part of the store was shrouded in gloom, the only light filtering through the front security gate. It was a maze of tall, dark wood shelves, a sanctuary of stories now standing silent vigil. She began a systematic, nerve-wracking search, moving down one aisle and up the next, her flashlight beam cutting a nervous path through the shadows. The silence was absolute, and then she heard it. A soft, wet, scraping sound coming from a closed door at the back of the store marked office. She froze, her blood turning to ice. It wasn't the guttural moan of the infected. It was quieter, more subtle. She crept toward the door, her flashlight held high. Pushing it open a few inches, she peered inside. In the center of the small, book-cluttered office, a man in a cardigan was on his knees, his back to her. His hands were scraping slowly, methodically at the wooden floorboards. He was whimpering, a low, constant sound of misery. He had been bitten on the neck. The wound was a dark, ragged crater in his flesh. He had likely retreated here to die, but he hadn't died, not completely. As if sensing her presence, he stopped scraping and slowly, unsteadily got to his feet. He turned and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. His eyes were milky white, his jaw slack. A thin line of drool and blood dripped onto his sweater. He took a shuffling step toward her, his arms rising zombie-like. This wasn't a monster in a horde. This was a single tragic man in a room full of books. But he was just as deadly. He lunged. The fight was not cinematic. It was ugly, clumsy, and terrifyingly intimate. He crashed into her, his weight pinning her against a desk. His teeth snapped inches from her face, his breath a foul wave of decay. She screamed and slammed the heavy end of the maglite into the side of his head. The impact was dull, sickening. He grunted but didn't stop, his mindless hunger overriding all pain. She struck him again and again, blind with terror, tears streaming down her face. It was a frantic, desperate battle in a darkened room. Finally, with a strength born of pure adrenaline, she shoved him off her. He stumbled backward, tripping over an overturned chair, and fell, his head hitting the corner of the heavy wooden desk with a sharp, final crack. He lay still. Silence returned to the bookstore, heavier and more profound than before. Sarah scrambled away, her back hitting the far wall as she slid to the floor, her body convulsing with sobs. She had just killed a man. She knew it wasn't a man, not anymore, but the act itself, the brutal, messy reality of it, had broken something inside her. After a long time, the shaking subsided, replaced by a cold, grim resolve. She got up and dragged a heavy filing cabinet in front of the office door, sealing the dead man inside. Then she went to the back service door and barricaded it with a heavy oak table and stacks of encyclopedias. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she was in a secure place, a fortress. She sat down on the floor in the main aisle of the bookstore, surrounded by the silent, watching spines of a million stories from a world that no longer existed. She was safe from the monsters outside. But as she looked down at her bandaged arm and felt the phantom sensation of a man's skull cracking under her flashlight, she was terrifyingly aware of the monsters she now had to face on the inside. The silence in the bound folio was a living entity. It was a heavy, suffocating presence that pressed in on Sarah from all sides, amplifying the frantic drumming of her own heart. The adrenaline from the fight, from the brutal, final act of killing, had ebbed away, leaving a toxic residue of nausea, trembling exhaustion, and a profound, soul-deep horror. She sat on the floor, the heavy maglite still clutched in her white-knuckled grip, her eyes fixed on the barricaded office door. Behind it lay the body of the man who had owned this place, this quiet sanctuary of stories. She had cracked his skull open. The thought was a jagged piece of glass in her mind, and every time it shifted, it cut her anew. She was a nurse. Her hands were trained to heal, to soothe, to save. Now they were instruments of brutal, desperate violence. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she pressed a hand to her forehead. Her skin felt hot, clammy. Was it a fever, or was it just the psychosomatic aftermath of terror and exertion? The ambiguity was a form of torture. The 4 scratches on her arm, hidden beneath the clean white gauze, began to throb in sync with her pulse, a venomous, rhythmic reminder of the unknown countdown that might be happening in her own blood. For an hour, maybe more, she remained paralyzed in the dusty aisle, trapped between the ghost in the back room and the potential monster inside her own body. But the will to live, that stubborn, primal engine, eventually sputtered back to life. She couldn't just sit here and die, either from fear or from infection. She had to move. She had to take stock. Pushing herself to her feet, her muscles protesting, she began a more thorough exploration of her new fortress. The back room she had first entered was a small storage area, but beyond it was a tiny kitchenette. It was a minor miracle. On a shelf sat a half-empty jar of instant coffee, a box of stale crackers, and 3 protein bars that were 6 months past their expiration date. To Sarah, it was a banquet. In a small cupboard under the sink, she found the real treasure, a dusty, unopened 24-pack of bottled water. She tore one open and drank deeply, the cool, clean liquid a balm to her raw throat. The office where the dead man lay was a no-go zone, but next to it was a small employee bathroom. The water was still running. Another miracle. These small victories felt monumental, pushing back the tide of despair inch by inch. She was building a life here, even if it was a life measured in minutes. It was in the dead man's office, peering through the crack in the door she didn't dare open fully, that she saw it. On the desk, next to a tipped-over mug and a stack of invoices, was a small, silver, battery-powered emergency radio. A connection, a voice. Her heart leaped. After dragging the heavy filing cabinet away from the door, just enough to slip inside, a task that sent waves of terror through her, she snatched the radio and retreated, sealing the dead man in his tomb once more. Back in the main part of the store, she sat on the floor, wiped the dust from the radio, and turned the dial. The speaker hissed with static, a dead, empty sound that mirrored the world outside. She twisted the tuning knob slowly, painstakingly, the static rising and falling. She passed dead air, faint fragments of music swallowed by the noise, and then she found it. A voice, clear, calm, and human, repeating this broadcast on all available emergency frequencies. I'm Daniel Hart, and you are listening to Central News Now. Sarah choked back a sob. She wasn't alone. In his subterranean broadcast bunker, Daniel Hart felt like a lighthouse keeper on a planet of storms. His world had shrunk to this small, soundproofed room and the disembodied voices of the few remaining experts and reporters he could still reach. They had managed to get a satellite link to Dr. Ella Monroe, who was now at a secure CDC relocation facility in Denver. Her voice, tinny and distant, was a beacon of scientific reason in the madness. What we are dealing with, Daniel, has been officially designated VNP1, viral neurodegenerative pathogen 1, Dr. Monroe explained, her tone professionally grim. The agent appears to target the brain and nervous system with a speed we've never encountered. It effectively destroys higher cognitive function, reason, memory, personality, while leaving the brainstem largely intact. Daniel processed this. So the body is alive, but the person is gone? In essence, Monroe confirmed, the incubation period is also alarmingly short. We have confirmed cases of symptoms developing within minutes of exposure, though the primary transmission vector still appears to be direct fluidic contact, primarily through saliva in a bite. She paused, and when she spoke,